All right, everybody, you just tuned into Random Radio. Welcome to another episode of Just Ask, the podcast where you ask the questions and we give you the answers. I'm your host, Nicholas John Random, and we are once again live at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. Today, our podcast is going to be all about the fabled Ark of the Covenant. So, our question today comes from Matt over in Utah. Now, Matt has heard a lot about the Ark. He's read a lot of things on the internet, done his own research, and, of course, it's featured in a number of movies. It's always this mysterious object like the Holy Grail, very similar. But he just wants to know simply what I know about the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the answer, Matt, is quite a lot. I know quite a lot about the Ark of the Covenant. So, today's podcast, we're just going to talk about the Ark, everything I know about it, and where it might be, what the deal is with it exactly. It's supposed to have mysterious powers and things like that. So let's go over it a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to say, just like at the beginning of all these podcasts, is remember, this is just my personal opinion. Everything in this podcast is based off of my experience, my knowledge, the research I've been able to do myself, and it is 100% my opinion. If you don't like my opinion, please feel free to change the podcast over to another podcast. Listen to something else, guys. Turn the volume down. It's that simple. We don't need to get all crazy about personal opinions and frustrated about anything like that. If you don't like it, switch over to something else. It's that easy, guys. It's just my opinion. So, now, where do we begin? The Ark of the Covenant. Well, so usually when people talk about the Ark, their first memory goes towards Moses. Moses and the Ten Commandments is usually where the Ark of the Covenant brings people. That or Indiana Jones. They did have it as the main focal point in Indiana Jones in one of the movies. So let's start with Moses. Actually, rather, let's start before Moses. See, people have a tendency to think that the first reference to the Ark of the Covenant, well, the Ark, is Moses. Moses supposedly in the Bible builds the Ark of the Covenant with instruction, with design from the Lord when he comes down from the mountain. Well, that's not necessarily true. And I'm not trying, again, Bible guys, I'm not trying to say that the Bible's wrong, even though, come on, guys, that book's been rewritten more than anything in the history. I can tell you, I personally have read at least 20 different versions of the regular Bible. Not to mention the fact that there's a million other books that are very, very similar to the Bible. Try reading the Quran sometime. All you guys who are such Bible-thumping guys, read the Quran sometime. It's pretty much the same story, just a few older versions of stories, a few extra characters. It's the same thing. Anyway, moving on from that, let's not go down a religious road real quick. But moving on, let's see. So the Bible says that Moses created, that he was instructed when he came down from the mountain with the tablets of law, that he was instructed to build this box, this ark, to house the Lord, essentially, basically to house the Lord and have a way to communicate with the Lord. Well, that's not the first instance of an ark. That's the first instance of the ark in the Bible. But arks actually had been around for a long time, or things, we weren't calling them arks necessarily, but things that were very, very similar. They were in several religions, these boxes, these powerful boxes that were created to house gods, were around for a long time, specifically in Egypt, where Moses and the Israelites came from as slaves. So the Egyptians had very similar boxes that they took along with them to the great battles. They strode these things out in front of their armies. Like I said, they kind of existed, these things, these arks kind of existed before the one in the Bible shows up. But let's just take a pause on that for a second, and we'll just talk about what the Bible says as far as the actual Ark of the Covenant is. So Moses, the guy who led the Israelites out of Egypt, and then they wandered in the desert for about 40 years trying to find a place to crash. Basically, he built this thing, or he instructed two Israelites, Bezalel and I believe his son, to build the ark. He's given very, very specific instructions from the Lord to house the tablets of stone, which are the tablets of law, which most people know as the Ten Commandments. So the ark was supposedly made out of acacia wood. It was, according to the Bible, 2.5 cubits in length. Now, cubit is a term of measurement they use in the Bible quite a lot. It was 1.5 cubits in depth and 1.5 cubits in height. The whole thing was made out of wood, and then it was completely covered in gold, gilded in gold, not just the outside, but the inside. And then there was to be gold crown molding put around the whole thing, and 4 little rings of gold, solid gold, were to be made attached to each one of its 4 corners so that you could put in wood poles to carry the ark. Now then there was a lid that most people call the mercy seal. It was also made completely of gold, and on top of it 2 cherubs sat with their wings facing each other, and there was specifically, according to the instructions, supposed to be a gap between these 2 cherubs. And then there was a whole, thing involving a veil to be placed over the ark at all times to cover it. Now, this is the description of how it's built in the Bible. Now, it's supposed to be holding the 10 Commandments, basically, and the first set of tablets. Again, unfortunately, most people haven't actually read the Bible. People go around and they like to say they're Christian and stuff like that, but most people haven't actually read the Bible. So in the Bible, there's actually 2 sets of commandments. Originally Moses goes up onto the mountain to talk to God, the burning bush, and God etches in stone these commandments that he wants the Israelites to follow. And it's said in the Bible, etched by his hand, by God's hand, God's finger. In other words, God made these stones and etched into these stones. Now, Moses comes down. There's this whole ridiculous story that's I'm not going to lie, and I'm not trying to poke fun at religion, but it's very reminiscent of the whole, Mormon religion, where what's his name's got the 2 golden plates, and then somebody questions him on the golden plates, and then he all of a sudden is like, oh no, I have to create 2 more new ones because we weren't supposed to read those plates, so I have to read from 2 different plates. It's very similar to that kind of story where Moses gets these 2 tablets from the mountain that God wrote, and he brings them down. And as soon as he gets to the bottom of the mountain, for some reason, now there's this long, drawn-out, silly reason that's in the Bible, but involving him seeing people, breaking the commandments right when he gets there, even though God told him they were doing that. So that whole logic doesn't make any sense. Anyway, the point is, as soon as Moses gets down from the from the mountain, he immediately smashes the 2 tablets that God just gave him, which you wouldn't think you would do. These are kind of important things. But he breaks those 2 tablets, and then he has to make 2 new tablets where he basically just writes down what were on the other tablets. So what's actually supposed to be in the Ark of the Covenant that the Israelites carried around are the 2 tablets that Moses wrote in combination with the bits and pieces of the original tablets that he broke for some random reason. So there's basically a bunch of stone that's supposed to be housed in there, and God. God is supposed to be in the ark. Well, what is the ark exactly? There's a lot of really interesting stories when it comes to the ark, for most of which are describing how dangerous this thing was. Even with Indiana Jones, the Ark of the Covenant is so dangerous that when they open it up, it kills everybody who looks at it. That's whoever has their eyes open. They don't really explain that in that Indiana Jones movie, but at the end of the movie, they open the ark, and everybody who just happens to have their eyes open gets killed and melted and all this kind of terrible stuff. Well, all throughout history, this ark is described as a very dangerous object. And there have been many, many theories as to what it actually is, but we'll talk about the religious context. I mean, we can talk about that all day. If it's God, God's doing all these kind of things. But personally, I believe it's more likely that it was a device. Now, when I say device, I know you're thinking, well, what the heck? What are you talking about? Are you one of these ancient aliens guys? Well, yes, I am, but not solely ancient aliens. I mean, like, we are so egotistical in our mindset as far as modern people that we can't think of ancient cultures as anything but Native Americans with stone tools and things like that. The Egyptians were highly advanced. That's where Moses came from, and the Israelites. They were in Egypt. They were highly advanced culture. And here's the thing: when it comes to our history, yes, do I believe aliens, were around and did some stuff? Absolutely, of course I do. I'm an educated man, and it's ridiculous to think that they didn't. I'm sorry, it's ridiculous. There's more than enough proof all over the world to show that aliens had some sort of hand in a bunch of different things that were going on in the world, both in the past and currently, guys. Now, I think they're different aliens, and I think the ones that happen to be in the past are long gone or dead. But yeah, I'm sure they had to do with a bunch of things that went on in the past. The Earth has been here for a very long time. But that's not just it. I also happen to personally believe that a lot of cultures in the past were highly scientifically adept. I believe personally, just like a lot of cultures and histories, the Mayans and the Native Americans and the Chinese and Japanese and cultures all over the world teach that we have actually gone through several cycles of life where we've reached pinnacles, giant pinnacles of modern technology and beyond, crazy technology, and then global catastrophe brought us back down to, back to the Stone Age essentially, and we had to restart. And we've had to do this a couple of times. I personally believe this is 100% true. I believe we've gone through several global catastrophes here on Earth, and we've had to restart our civilizations multiple times. People assume that, 4,000, 8,000 years ago, we were just stone people. We were just stone tool carrying guys. I don't think that's true. So here's something I like to remind people of. Okay, so we are now in 2020. 250 years ago, we were driving horse and buggies and using, wax candles as our means of life. We had nothing going on, essentially, technology-wise. This is just 250 years ago. And within 250 years to now, we now have microcomputers so small that we have the entire contents of the internet in your back pocket on a phone. Like, that's within 250 years, a span of 250 years. Even if you have no idea how long man has been on the planet, as far as whether it's thousands of years, millions of years, or whatever, we have actual written history currently still around of thousands of years. Do you really think, this is the point I try and bring home to people all the time, do you really think if it only took us a span of 250 years to go from horse and buggy and candles to microcomputers in our back pockets, do you really think that in the span of just a few thousand years, that we never had a technological leap like that over thousands of years? It only took us a couple hundred. Do you think in the entire span of human civilization we never had another technological leap? Not once along the entire history of humanity that we know of, let alone the humanity that could have existed before our written history and oral history. It's just logic, guys. It's just logic. Odds are our ancient cultures were much more scientifically adept than we believe them to be. So I believe the Egyptians, for one, were definitely part of that culture. Now, despite what anybody will tell you, the pyramids themselves, there's almost no written account anywhere ever, despite what they will tell you in books and stuff like that. There's literally almost zero written account of how they built the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza. Zero. Which points to the fact that they were probably there before the current dynasties of Egypt. They were probably there already, built by somebody else or a foreign culture before them. And considering the fact that there's pyramids on every single continent in the world, probably a global culture. But we're not going to go down that road, and I'd love to some other time on another podcast. Right now, what we're going to talk about is the Ark of the Covenant. And the reason I brought up this technology thing is because there's been a popular theory that say the Ark of the Covenant is an electric device since the 1740s. Yeah, I said the 1740s. I mean, they discovered how to make a Leyden jar or a valence jar, which is essentially a crude battery. They figured out how to build one of these in the 1740s, and the moment they did, a guy named George Lichtenberg, he was a highly educated man, and he was a noted historian also, as well as being one of the founders of electrical science. And he had noted in his personal notes that the way the Ark of the Covenant is described and built in the Bible is very similar to a large capacitor, a large Leyden jar, which is it's a device that stores electricity. And this is a popular theory. And the reason I brought up the Egyptians and the pyramid thing is because there's a chamber inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is called the King's Chamber. Now, the actual Great Pyramids of Giza, they're not tombs, despite what everybody will tell you. That's ridiculous. I never found a mummy in there. All the great pharaohs of Egypt were buried far, far away in a different place. But there's this chamber called the King's Chamber inside the pyramid. Now, the dimensions of this chamber, of this inner chamber, are almost exactly the dimensions of the supposed Bible-described Ark of the Covenant. What's interesting is those dimensions are the exact same dimensions of the tabernacle, which is supposed to be which is essentially the first resting place of the ark created by the Israelites. It's the way it's described. It sounds more like a tiny, tiny movable church. Anyway, it's the same size as this tabernacle. In Solomon's temple, years later, that's built by the Israelites. There's a Holy of Holies, which is built specifically to house the Ark of the Covenant, is the exact same size. This tells me that in the inside of the pyramid, most likely, there was an ark sitting in that chamber, in the King's Chamber. Because the description of the King's Chamber and the way it's built is very, very similar to the description of the Holy of Holies inside Solomon's temple, and various other places that have similar design structure to house a little box that's very similar dimensions. What I'm trying to say is it's very probable, in my personal opinion, that the Ark of the Covenant was some sort of valence jar, some sort of Leyden jar, some sort of small capacitor or battery, an electrical battery. Now, what it did in the Pyramid of Giza, no idea. Who knows? That technology is so long gone, who the heck knows what was going on there. But it seems like it was a power source. It could have been as simple as static electricity. If you are described in the Bible, they put a wool cloth to shield the Ark of the Covenant, but it's in the desert, and you put a wool cloth over a positive and negative terminal, which are supposed to be the two cherub wings that are separated on purpose, and you're going to create a static electricity charge, which could be held in the inside, which was also specifically designed to be gold on the inside. It's very interesting that they put gold on the inside of this chest that was never supposed to be opened. It seems kind of strange unless you're trying to hold energy. It's also, most people never bother to look into this, but the tablets themselves in the Bible, the tablets of law or the Ten Commandments, we see all these old movies and, cartoons with Moses carrying the two tablets, and they look like stone tablets. That's not what they're described as in the Bible. And again, most people haven't read their Bible. But in the Bible, they're made out of stone from the Lord's throne, from God's throne. It's a description. Now, God's throne is supposedly made out of blue sapphire. So the tablets aren't stone in the sense that we normally think of them as rocks. They are sapphires. These are two enormous sapphires. Actually, more than two, because, he had the original two tablets that he broke. So they fill this box, this golden electrical box full of sapphires, which are highly electrical stones, highly conductive stones. I think that's very, very interesting, and a very, very interesting the part that's thrown out in a lot of people's description of the Ark. Now you're saying, why are we talking about so you think the Ark of the Covenant is an electrical device? What the heck? Why would you think that? Well, because all the stories involving the Ark of the Covenant are very, very interesting and very, very device-like. You know, there's a story where a guy is, he's next to the cart that the Ark of the Covenant is being pulled on by a ox, and the ox looks like it's going to fall over. So he's trying to guard this thing. So he reaches out and grabs one of the corners of the Ark, so it doesn't fall, and he's instantly struck dead. Instantly. Well, if you instantly were electrocuted to death, you'd probably die. There's also numerous stories of the Ark of the Covenant showing up in different towns that the Israelites travel to, and everybody gets sick and die, or everybody dies of some sort of strange illness. Who knows what that is? There's theories that it's not a valence jar, that it's more of something like cold fusion, which could be. Maybe it was a cold fusion storing device or whatever. There's also the story of whenever they built Solomon's temple, the priests took the Ark into Solomon's temple and placed it in the Holy of Holies for the first time. All of a sudden, crazy smoke plumes out everywhere out of the Ark and fills the room so much that all the priests have to leave the room because it's so smoky and stuff like that. Well, it sounds like they just turned on the Ark or plugged it in. You know what I'm saying? It sounds like a device. There's another story of two guys who put incense next to the Ark in the tabernacle the wrong way, or they used the wrong kind of incense, and this offense basically shot fire out of the Ark and killed them on the spot. And it didn't destroy their bodies; they just died instantly. And it's because the fire killed their souls or some nonsense. Well, again, it sounds like they might have been just electrocuted to death. Now, there's also an interesting thought, which is, did Moses really build this ark? Because here's a little story I'm going to tell you, and you know the story, but I'm going to make a few changes and see if it makes sense to you. So the story of Moses, most people know the story of Moses, and I'm not going to go down the whole story, but I'm going to say this. So Moses was, he was an orphan that was taken in by the Pharaoh and raised as a prince of Egypt, along with the would-be Pharaoh. And then he goes out later and into the desert, and all this kind of stuff happens, and he later is welcomed in he realizes he's an Israelite. And then he wants to save the slaves and lead them out of Egypt and all this stuff. But let's go back to the beginning there. So he was raised with the future Pharaoh of Egypt. He was raised as a prince of Egypt. But they knew from a boy, he wasn't going to be Pharaoh because he wasn't of royal blood. He wasn't a Pharaoh. But he was still a prince of Egypt. Now, when you are a prince in any culture in the world, they still train you up. They still teach you all the things they can teach you, and teach you how to fight, and teach you how to do all these crazy stuffs. Well, since he wasn't going to be Pharaoh, what they decided to do is they sent Moses to train with the priests of Egypt. And when I say priests, back then priests meant scientists. They were the doctors, the chemists, the builders, the architects, the scientists. So he studied with these scientists for his whole life until he wandered out into the desert. This is the part that most people don't pay attention to in the Bible, again, if they've even bothered to read it. So when he went into the desert to find himself and become a shepherd for years and years, he was 40 years old. So this is the trippy part about the Bible, and this is one of the things that never makes any sense as far as the math goes. But so when he left from Egypt to go become a shepherd, essentially, for 40 years, he left for 40 years. He was 40 years old. According to the Bible, he was 40 years old when he left, and he was a shepherd for another 40 years before he came back to Egypt. In other words, whenever Moses supposedly left Egypt with all the slaves, he was 80 years old. But that's neither here nor there. The math doesn't make up, but the point is, he was a 40-year-old man whenever he left to go wander in become a shepherd for a little while. A 40-year-old man. He had lived a whole life as this prince of Egypt. Almost his whole life studying with these priests of Egypt, learning all the sciences that they knew, all their secrets. And he was top dog, so he could learn any of the sciences he wanted to, any of them. There's that part in the Bible where there's like a standoff, like there's a whole standoff on the river where Moses asks God to turn the river to blood, and everybody freaks out or whatever, and the Pharaoh looks over at his priests, and they take a bowl of water, and they do, and they turn it to red colored stuff that looks like blood too. That's because they all had the same tricks. They all learned that they were the same, people. They were the same, like he had trained with them for years and years and years of his life. He knew all their tricks. The reason I bring this up is because I have a theory. Do you remember at the end of the 10 plagues where, all the firstborn of Egypt are slain, and because of this, the Pharaoh is super melancholy and sad, and he's sitting in his throne, and Moses comes to him one last time and says, "See, I told you, you should have just listened to me and let me go." And the Pharaoh is like, "Okay, fine, nothing else. I don't want anything to go down. Just leave. Take your people and go. I'll let you go. You're fine." And so Moses does. He leaves. The Pharaoh lets him leave Egypt with all of his people, and then they're on their way to leave, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Pharaoh changes his mind and gathers the armies and starts chasing them. And that's why they have to part the sea and go through the sea and all that kind of stuff. You remember that part? Didn't you think it was interesting that it went from where the Pharaoh's like, "Cool, yeah, you can just go, to all of a sudden, "No, why? Let's gather the armies. We're going to chase you out of town." Where did that come from? Nobody ever thinks about where that came from. Well, here's a theory. The way, like I said, the king's chamber in the pyramid is designed, it's designed specifically to fit something that's around the same size as the Ark of the Covenant. So there's a theory that there was an ark in the king's chamber, and whenever Moses was given permission to leave and take the Israelites as a last move, they took out the ark, which, if it was some sort of power source, would have really messed up society, as far as the Egyptians go. If they were like, and it didn't have to necessarily be Moses himself, but let's just say the Israelites, while they're on their way out, were like, "Ha, we win, now we get to leave, we're not slaves anymore, ha, let's just take this ark." It's their power thing. We take it with us, and we can start a whole society somewhere else with our own power. And they did, and they took it out, and they took it with them. And then later, the Pharaoh's like trying to figure out what the heck's going on, and all of a sudden there's no power in Egypt, because I want you to think about Egypt with power. So he's pissed off now that they took his power, his battery, and decides then to gather the armies and chase them out of Egypt. I think that makes a little more sense. They stole the Ark of the Covenant. Whether or not it was a power source or not, even if it wasn't a power source, even if it was just like a sacred object or whatever, that would still piss him off. Like, they stole this sacred object. And it would make a little bit more sense than guys building a device, people who had been slaves, poor people, all of a sudden coming across the materials to build a golden ark. It makes a little bit more sense that they just had it already and they were taking it away. But who knows? That's the thing, is we really don't know. But according to the Bible, he builds the darn thing. And even if he did build it, again, he would have known all that science. He would have known the science to build his own. And there have been tons of arks. Contrary to popular belief, there's not one Ark of the Covenant. There have been tons of arks. There were arks in ancient Egypt history, like I had said before, going around. They would take them into battle. There's stories of the Israelites using them in battle themselves. There's the famous story of them taking the ark and attaching big giant horns to the ark somehow in front of it, walking around the walls of Jericho several times while blasting these horns next to the Ark of the Covenant, and then all of a sudden the walls crumble and fall. That kind of sounds like you hooked up these horns to an amplifier and were like sound blasting the walls. Like, it's very probable that this thing was some sort of device, like a battery. I think it's very probable. But That's just a theory. Now let's get rid of all that. Let's go into some of the history as far as people. The biggest question when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant is, where did it end up? Who has it? Where did it go? Well, the Israelites had it for a long time. It ended up with King David, and Solomon in Solomon's temple. At one point in time, the Philistines took it and captured it in battle. And then there's this weird story about them placing it in front of a statue of Dagon, which Dagon was one of their gods. And the statue the next morning was found messed up. Then they fixed it and put it back in its place. And then the next day, the same thing happened. And then people had tumors and all sorts of problems. It sounds like the bubonic plague kind of hit them, to be honest. And if I've read the history correct, they had little bulbous marks all over them that sound very similar to the bubonic plague. So either way, the Philistines were so freaked out by this that they actually returned the ark to the Israelites of their own volition and presented it to them like in fear, and they gave them like gold and a bunch of other stuff with the ark as like here, just take this thing as offerings. Very, very strange. Then let's see. I mean, like I said, King David had it, and some things went on. Then it was in Solomon's temple. Now here's where it gets interesting. This is when different stories start to pop up in different places. So in the 500 BCs, the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple, and they took all sorts, all the goodies out of Solomon's temple and all the prizes and stuff like that. The Ark of the Covenant is not one of the mentioned things that they took, but a bunch of other things are, and it does mention them taking all the holy vessels of the Lord, which, could be the Ark. That's possible. But the Ark specifically, the Ark that was in the Holy of Holies, isn't mentioned as one of their prizes that they took after conquest. The most prevalent story, and it's one of the most detailed and most interesting stories, but it's got a bunch of holes that nobody ever points out, which I think is interesting, is that the Ark of the Covenant actually ended up in Ethiopia. Now, a lot of people are like, what the heck, Ethiopia? How the heck does that make any sense? Why would the Ark of the Covenant go to Ethiopia? Well, there's a really interesting story when it comes down to it, and it's actually extremely well documented. So there's a story. So Solomon, King Solomon, his temple was amazing, and he had built up his town Zion and all this stuff, and he had been married. He married several times. He had several wives. He only had one child from any one of his wives, but there was an interesting little tryst that went on with him and the Queen of Sheba. Now, this is a very famous story, and it, like I said, it's written, there's a bunch of accounts, some really, really old accounts. So essentially, the Queen of Sheba, after his temple's built and all this stuff, Solomon invites all these dignitaries from all over the world to come see his goodies, to come see his temple, to come see his place and everything that his culture is built up and everything like that. And the Queen of Sheba sends an emissary, and he comes and checks it out and is like, holy crap, this place is amazing. Oh my God, I gotta tell my queen. He goes back and tells his queen, how amazing the place is. And she decides to visit herself, which is extremely rare. So the queens of Sheba back then, by the way, were all virgin queens. They were virgin queens for hundreds of years, running what is now Ethiopia. But they were all, it was a thing. They were virgin queens that ran this nation. And they were only second to basically Egypt. Like, they were quite a big kingdom, very fruitful when it comes to technology, gold, just the city wealth itself. So for the Queen of Sheba to suddenly go visit another place was a big, big deal. And she took caravans of hundreds of people and all this stuff. She brought tons and tons of gold as an offering, and all spices and trade goods and all this kind of stuff to visit Solomon. She goes to visit Solomon. She has a fantastic time, and there's a very poetic version. There's several very poetic versions of what happens with her and Solomon, but it seems like basically like Solomon falls in love with this chick, even though he's married, falls in love with this chick, and and bangs her. Now there's a poetic version of the story where it doesn't happen until the very last night before she's supposed to leave, and there's all this nonsense about him tricking her with spiced foods, and she gets thirsty, and he makes this silly blah blah blah. Anyway, the basically, who knows what actually happened, but essentially he sleeps with the Queen of Sheba, and then when she's leaving, he gives her a ring that has his seal on it, and he says, if you have a kid and it's a boy, someday send him back to me and have him wear this ring so that I know that's him. Well, she gets back to Ethiopia, and she actually gets pregnant, and it's a boy, and she has a son, and she gives him a name. I don't remember what his original name was. Later it becomes Menelik, and when he's about 20 years old, she's like, you need to go meet your father, who is King Solomon, and she sends him up to meet King Solomon. And when he gets there, everybody's super happy to see him, and the king, like I said, he's only had one other child, so he's like super ecstatic to see that he has a strong boy, like strong man to be his heir that he's super proud of, and he really really wants him to stay there. He's like welcomed into his family. They renamed him, like I said, and the young prince is like, no, I need to go back to Ethiopia because that's where I think the future of our religion is going to be. This is all according to history. So Solomon's really upset by this, and he's like, okay, fine, well, take a bunch of my. He essentially takes a bunch of the rich kids, like the higher up kids, the firstborn sons that are like super wealthy or super influential, and sends him with his son Menelik to go back to Ethiopia. Now, they are supposed to take a copy of the Ark of the Covenant with them, like a replica, as a sign of, the new religion and all this kind of stuff, and they're taking God with them. Well, I supposedly, according to, this is where the story gets a little weird. According to history, some of those young sons that were being sent with this young prince back to Ethiopia didn't really want to go to Ethiopia. So as a kind of like screw you to the king, they took the copy they were supposed to take, according to history, they took the copy they were supposed to take with them, and they replaced that replica with the actual Ark of the Covenant and took it down to Ethiopia and left the replica in the Holy of Holies. Now that's the tricky bit, because did they really do that, or did they just say that because later on they had this ark and they wanted to be able to say, no, this is the real one, guys. This is the real one. We got the real one. We totally switched out. This one's not a fake. It's not a replica. It's a real one. Who knows? I mean, who really knows? But so there's a story that he took the Ark of the Covenant down to Ethiopia and built a church around it. It's been in this church now for thousands of years. And there's a church there that has been guarded by one person, one priest, for a very long time. He only anoints one other priest to take his place when he's about to die, and that guy takes his place. They're never allowed to leave that church. They guard that Ark of the Covenant their entire lives, and it's been there for thousands of years. The thing about it is, whenever he went back, when he took it back, one of his first decrees as ruler of that region was that these churches, any church that was built around the area, was to have a replica of the Ark of the Covenant built as well and put in the center of their church. Now that's the part where it becomes tricky, because if this happened thousands of years ago, how do we know whether or not that the ark that these guys supposedly have in this church that has been there for a long time, the original one we're talking about now, how do we know that's a real one or not just a fake one that they've been guarding for, a replica that they've been guarding for thousands of years? It could have just been one of the replicas, could have just been the oldest church to survive, and it's just one of the replicas. More importantly, it could have all been a replica. Like I said, in the original stories, they have a replica that's built, and they're supposed to take that down to Ethiopia by Solomon's request. And it's only according to the story, that they actually switched out the replica with the real deal. But how do we know that? We have no idea. They could have just taken that replica down, and that's what they had. But to save face, the king might have been like, no, this is the real one, I swear. Why would the king give us a replica? What's the point of that? So he could have just been like, no, this is the real deal. This is the real ark, and we're going to, just to help spread his church and his reign. Totally possible. Who knows? There's also a bunch of other theories when it comes to where it might have ended up. That one is one of the biggest theories, and a lot of people still think that that's where the Ark of the Covenant is. There's a bunch of other stories, though. There's like a one-off story where the prophet Jeremiah is warned that the Babylonian invasion that's going to happen in Solomon's temple is going to happen, and he, in advance, takes the ark and the tabernacle and the altar and everything and buried them in a cave somewhere. But that's just kind of a one story. Then there's this really interesting one in southern Africa. So the Lembe people of southern Africa have claimed that their ancestors carried the ark into a cave in South Africa, which is really an interesting one that almost nobody ever hears about this one. But they have, the Lembe people, I don't remember when it was they were supposed to have taken the ark, but they said they carried this ark into a cave in South Africa or whatever, and it was there for a really long time. There's a couple of accounts by them, and one of them is really, really interesting to me when we were talking about earlier the electric ark thing, the idea that it might be a device, because there are oral traditions that whenever they actually brought it to Lembe, the actual ark blew up. There's a description, an oral tradition that says when they brought that ark to Lembe, it blew up. And then they were like, well, that's weird. That sucks. And they took the pieces of it and the core, which again would have been those sapphire bits if it was the real ark that was built by Moses. They took that and they built a new one. They constructed a new one, a replica. Again, everybody with these replicas. But they took a replica and they put it into a cave. And that's where it sat for a really, really long time. In the 40s, some missionary guy found this replica in a cave down there, and it was there. So was that the real ark? Or obviously it wasn't if according to their story it blew up, but was that the remnants of the real Ark of the Covenant? Who knows? There's a bunch of European theories that the Knights Templar at some point in time took it to the chateau, Rennes-le-Chateau in southern France. That place is very mysterious and interesting, and the same thing has been said about the Holy Grail, like maybe the Holy Grail was brought there too. And then whenever when World War I broke out, supposedly the things that were there, the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant, were moved to the United States is the theory. And then there's some wild theories when it comes to that, because there's all these mysterious, essentially treasure mappy kind of things that are going on in the United States that some people believe were actually left around, like the original Statue of Liberty's torch and some weird stuff like that, that point to the fact that a hidden sacred object was put there by the Freemasons somewhere and moved to be protected. And people think that might have been the Ark of the Covenant. There's also Oak Island. People think it could have been moved from Rennes-le-Chateau to Oak Island and buried at the bottom of that crazy, crazy treasure pit that's there that they've been trying to get in for hundreds of years. Teddy Roosevelt even tried to get into it. There's all sorts of theories when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant and its whereabouts, but I don't know. So, what was the Ark of the Covenant? It was either, like the Bible says, some sort of box to house the Lord and the Lord's word, and Moses could communicate with this box, and it was placed in holy places all over the world. Or it was a big giant battery. As a scientific man myself, I think there's a small possibility that that's what it was. It was some sort of valence jar, some sort of Leyden jar. It was a big battery. I know that's my opinion, and people who are religious or who have no concept of ancient history when it comes to science, there's there's depictions of light bulbs in Egypt, people. Like, we really have to step out of our box a little bit and realize that things aren't what they seem when it comes to the past. Not everybody was using rocks to carve into walls and things like that. They were a little bit more scientifically adept than we give them credit for. Where did it end up? Who knows? Honestly, who knows? What do I think? Where do I think it ended up? I don't think that there was one arc. I think based off of the accumulation of stories, like I said, I think the arc, especially if it was some sort of battery, there were probably several of them. There were probably multiples. And whenever there's all these stories of replicas, I think what they mean by that is they were building just new versions of these little batteries based off of the design and construction of the old ones. Like, they were just it was just technology being passed down. They were like, oh, this is that, and we're going to build that, and we're going to build this, and we're going to build that. Even, I mean, that could have even been possible in the Ethiopian scenario. I mean, who knows? That could have been why he ordered all of these replicas built at all of his churches. Honestly, we don't know. But I have no idea. I have no idea where it would have ended up. It would have been very interesting if one of them ended up in the United States. That would not have surprised me in any way, shape, or form. Before or after World War I. It would not have surprised me if it ended up in Ethiopia, but I don't think, as unfortunately as well documented as that story is, I don't think, even if an ark was brought to Ethiopia, I don't think it was. I know how people think, and like I said, it's much more likely that those guys just brought a replica down, and those people, because that replica, especially if it was a power device, had some sort of power, if it had some sort of electric abilities, that they were just like, oh crap, this is the real thing. It's doing the stuff. It must be the real ark. I think it's likely that there were more than one, but we may never know. But I think that's going to be it, guys. That is everything I know about the Ark of the Covenant, which, as you can see, was quite a lot. I rambled quite a lot, but if you start listening to these podcasts, you'll know that's what I do. That's why I always say we might as well call this podcast Random Rambles, except for I don't really want to say that 10 times fast. So I think that's going to be it for us today. If you like our podcast, don't forget to click that like button down there at the bottom. If you want to support us a little bit, head over to our Patreon account at patreon.com/randomradio, and you can become a supporting member, and we'll get you some swag and maybe some early episodes if we can. If you have a question for me that you'd like answered about, again, can be anything in the world. It doesn't have to be all this mysterious stuff that we're going to start with. I'm just starting with these interesting, mysterious ones because they're going to give you a taste for what this podcast is going to be about. It can be questions about literally anything you want to ask or want to know. Send them over to my email at random@cafestimulus.com. We are once again live at Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. If you ever feel like coming in for a delicious cup of coffee or just a good conversation, stop by. I might be here and we might be able to chat. You might be able to get your question answered in person. But that's going to be it for us today, guys. We'll catch you on the next episode of Just Ask, everybody. Have a good night.